No daydreaming ever found a place in her mind. Life for Emily had always been a battle, not the kind where heroes emerge victorious, but a quiet war that eroded her spirit every day. At 18, while her classmates envisioned bright futures, Emily fought just to see another sunrise. Lost in the crowd, she was invisible to the world, yet glaringly visible to those eager for a victim. And none were worse than Brad. Emily's life had never been easy. In her final year of high school, while others discussed prom, college applications, and weekend parties, her days were defined solely by the struggle to survive. Her world was small, confined to the dim, cramped apartment she shared with her mother, a weary woman working double shifts just to pay the rent. Their moments together were few, limited to the rare mornings when her mother managed a simple breakfast before leaving for work. There was no father, no siblings, no relatives to lean on. At school, Emily's isolation made her an easy target. Coming from a modest background, she wore plain clothes that never followed the latest trends, didn't have the newest phone, and certainly never sported designer sneakers. Quiet and introverted, she never stood up for herself, traits that made her the perfect prey for Brad and his gang. Brad was no ordinary bully. He was the school's golden boy, charismatic, handsome, and the son of a powerful businessman with deep community connections. No one dared stand up to him. Teachers turned a blind eye, students laughed along, and anyone who dared oppose him soon faced harsh consequences. For reasons unknown, Brad had chosen Emily as his personal amusement. What began as subtle harassment soon escalated. A cruel joke here, a whispered insult there, an accidental collision that sent her books crashing to the floor. The torment steadily increased. Brad was not alone in his cruelty. He had 6 loyal followers: Ryan, Tyler, Alex, Ethan, Kevin, and Brian. Each one competed to outdo the other in humiliating Emily. They tripped her in the hallways, laughed when she fell, and publicly ridiculed her. They spread vicious rumors, falsely claiming that Emily craved male attention and had done things she never had. As these lies circulated, even the girls began to avoid her, afraid that associating with her might make them the next target. One day they stole her homework and turned it in as their own, causing her to fail an assignment. When Emily confronted Brad about it, he merely smirked and said, "Don't be so dramatic, Emily. Just redo it." This incident was not isolated. It was an unrelenting barrage of torment, every day, every hour, every moment spent in their presence. The cruelty reached a new low when they decided that mere verbal and physical humiliation was not enough. They wanted total control over her. One afternoon, they cornered Emily in an empty classroom. Brad ordered, "Clean this up," as he kicked over a trash can filled with crumpled papers and leftover food, scattering its contents all over the floor. Emily clenched her fists, staring at the mess. Ryan taunted, "Did you hear? I said clean it up." When she hesitated, Brad grabbed the back of her head and shoved her toward the garbage. "Do it, or things will get worse for you," he warned. With her heart pounding wildly, Emily fell to her knees and began picking up the trash with trembling hands. The boys erupted in laughter, snapping photos and recording videos, reveling in her misery. That night, Emily returned home and wept in silence. She longed to tell her mother about the torment, but what could she possibly say? That her life had become a living hell? That at school she was treated like an animal? Her mother was already burdened with bills, everyday chores, and the exhaustion of long work hours. Emily couldn't bear to add more weight to her. Yet Brad and his gang did not relent. One of the worst days came when they forced her to clean the boys' restroom. The plan had been premeditated. They had deliberately left it in a disgusting state, and when they spotted her alone in the hallway, they dragged her inside. Tyler sneered, "You should consider yourself lucky. This is the closest you'll ever get to experiencing a boys' bathroom." Overwhelmed by the foul stench that made her dizzy, Emily felt nauseous, but she had no choice. Resisting was not an option. She knew all too well that defiance would only lead to even greater cruelty. As she scrubbed the filthy floor, Brad loomed above her with a cruel grin. "You know, Emily, you should thank us. We're giving you purpose in life." His words echoed in her ears as he and his gang left her there, shaking, humiliated, and feeling utterly invisible. Teachers ignored her suffering, and the silence of her peers deepened her isolation even further. Then something changed. Emily began to feel unwell. At first, it was just a slight discomfort, a fleeting burning sensation she dismissed as stress. But soon, small sores appeared, and the pain intensified until she could no longer ignore it. One afternoon, with anxiety gripping her, Emily went to the local clinic. Her hands were clammy, and her breath came in uneven gasps as she sat in the examination room. When the doctor returned, his face was inscrutable. "You tested positive for an STD," he said softly, carefully watching her reaction. For a moment, her heart stopped. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "That's not possible. I've never, I've never been with anyone." The doctor sighed gently. "STDs can be transmitted in ways other than sexual contact. There have been cases where people contracted them through unsanitary conditions, shared towels, public restrooms, even contaminated medical equipment." The doctor's words swirled in Emily's mind, mixing confusion, disbelief, and horror. Now she carried an incurable disease, a cruel twist in a life already marred by torment. Everything that Brad and his gang had inflicted upon her converged into one devastating reality. Her life, already unbearable, now felt ruined beyond repair. That night, Emily locked herself in her bedroom and stared into the mirror. The reflection that met her eyes was no longer that of the timid, unassuming girl she once was. Something inside her had irrevocably changed. Brad and his gang had stripped away her dignity, her self-confidence, and her happiness. Yet in that moment, a slow, twisted smile crept across her face. They had spent a year torturing her. Now it was time for her to reclaim control. For the first time in her life, the girl who had always felt powerless seized power. All night she lay awake, staring at the ceiling as dark, consuming thoughts raced through her mind. The anger she had buried for so long had morphed into something darker, a force that ignited every part of her being. Brad and his gang had reduced her to a laughingstock, humiliating her before the entire school. But now she possessed the perfect weapon to make them pay, not like a cold-blooded murderer, but in a way that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The next morning, Emily walked into school with a newfound purpose. Before leaving home, she stood in front of her closet and carefully selected her outfit. No more oversized hoodies or layers of fabric to hide behind. Today, she chose something different, a fitted crop top that accentuated her slender waist and a short skirt that revealed more of her legs than ever before. She curled her hair, applied just a touch of makeup, and when she looked in the mirror, she hardly recognized herself. This was no longer the timid Emily of the past. This was the beginning of their downfall. As soon as she stepped onto campus, every eye seemed to fix on her. She could feel the shift in energy. People who had never noticed her before now stole glances at her. Boys whispered among themselves and stared a little too long, while girls exchanged curious side eyes, wondering when and how she had changed so drastically. But the most satisfying reaction came from Brad and his gang. They were huddled by the lockers, laughing about something, when Brad's gaze landed on her. His conversation halted mid-sentence, and the smirk on his face faded. Emily held his gaze without a flicker of fear. In that silent, charged moment, the tables had finally turned. Emily met Brad's gaze, a small, almost imperceptible smirk playing on her lips. Brad nudged Aaron, whispering something, and soon the entire group was looking at her. But this time, she wasn't just the target of their jokes. Now she was the center of their curiosity. She knew how guys like Brad worked. He wasn't interested in weak girls. He liked a challenge, someone who seemed out of reach, someone who made him work for it. So she played her part perfectly. She didn't approach him. She didn't make it easy. Instead, she let him come to her. At lunch, she sat alone at her usual table, deliberately pretending to be focused on her phone. It didn't take long before she sensed a presence in front of her. "Hey!" Brad slid into the seat across from her. Emily slowly lifted her eyes as if she had only just noticed him. "Hey!" Brad leaned in slightly, studying her face. "You look different." Emily shrugged. People change. A knowing smirk tugged at Brad's lips. Yeah? What brought this on? Emily tilted her head, pretending to think. Maybe I just got tired of being the quiet, boring girl. Brad chuckled. I like it. It suits you. She gave him a small, teasing smile, then stood up, walking away without another word. She could feel his eyes burning into her back. The game had begun. Over the next few days, Emily made sure to keep Brad and his gang hooked. She didn't throw herself at them. She was careful, calculated. She made them chase her. She flirted, but only just enough to keep them wanting more. A light touch on the arm during a conversation, a laugh at their jokes, leaning in just a little closer when she spoke. And one by one, they all fell into her trap. Aaron was the first. He had always been one of the eager ones, always trying to impress Brad. When Emily finally made him believe he was winning her over, he took the bait without hesitation. One night she invited him to an empty classroom after school. Just for a little fun, she whispered in his ear. Aaron practically ran there. That night she made sure he got exactly what he wanted, without protection. After Aaron, it was Brian, then Tyler, Liam, Matthew, and Jake. She worked her way through the group methodically, carefully ensuring that none of them suspected what was happening. Each one thought he was special. Each one thought he was the only one she was giving herself to. But in reality, she was sealing their fate. And finally, it was Brad's turn. She saved him for last because he was the leader. He was the one who had orchestrated her suffering for an entire year. She wanted him to fall the hardest, and he did. Brad, the untouchable, the king of the school, the guy who had always seen her as nothing more than a pathetic loser. He became obsessed with her. He would text her constantly, trying to set up meetups. He grew possessive, jealous. He wanted to know if she was seeing anyone else. And she played him perfectly, leading him exactly where she wanted. It didn't take long. About 2 weeks after her final encounter, the first signs appeared. Aaron was the first to notice something was wrong. Emily saw him in the hallway one morning, pale, sweating, nervously scratching at his arms. He was whispering something to Brian, who looked just as distressed. Then came the rumors. Something was happening. One by one, the boys started disappearing from school, calling in sick, looking exhausted and worn out when they did show up. Then the bomb dropped. Aaron was the first to visit the doctor, and what he found out shattered him, an incurable STD. The realization hit like a train wreck, and as the others got tested, the horror only grew. They all had it, every single one of them. The panic was instant. Brad was the last to find out, and Emily made sure she was there to witness it. She was standing near the lockers when she saw him storming down the hallway, his face twisted in rage. He was looking for her, and she was waiting. Because this was the moment she had been living for. This was the moment she would watch them crumble, just like they had crumbled her. And it was only just beginning. Emily knew it was coming. She had been waiting for this moment, the inevitable explosion. For days she had watched as Brad and his gang unraveled. The confident smirks they once wore had vanished, replaced by fear and paranoia. They barely spoke to each other anymore. They barely showed up to class. And then the breaking point came. It was lunchtime, and the cafeteria was filled with the usual chatter of students. Emily sat at her usual spot, eating alone, when she felt a presence behind her. Before she could react, a hand grabbed her by the hair and yanked her up from her seat. A gasp spread through the cafeteria. Brad. His face was red with fury, his grip on her hair tight. Emily. He growled through clenched teeth. Emily didn't scream. She didn't even flinch. Instead, she smiled, a slow, knowing smile that only made him angrier. "Let go of me, Brad," she said calmly, her voice dripping with amusement. Brad dragged her through the cafeteria, his gang following behind him like shadows. The students parted, too afraid to intervene. They knew something was about to go down. He pulled her into one of the deserted hallways and shoved her against the wall. "You did this to us," he hissed, his face inches from hers. Emily tilted her head. "Did what?" "Don't play dumb," Brad roared, slamming his fist into the wall beside her head. "We all have it, every single one of us, and the only person we all slept with was you." Emily's smile widened. "So what?" she said. her voice laced with mock innocence. You think I forced you? You think I tricked you? No, Brad. You wanted it. You all wanted it. You infected us. Ryan yelled from behind Brad. You ruined our lives. Emily's gaze turned ice cold. You ruined mine first. Silence. Brad's hands clenched into fists. His breathing was ragged. You knew, he muttered. You knew you had it. Emily nodded. Of course I knew. Brad's eye twitched. Why? Her smile faded, and for the first time, pure rage flashed across her face. Because you deserve it, she whispered. For every time you made me feel worthless, for every time you laughed at me, humiliated me, treated me like trash. You don't get to walk away from this. You don't get to just live your perfect little lives while I suffer. No, Brad. Now we all suffer. Brad let out a yell of pure frustration and slammed her against the lockers. You're sick, he spat. You're fucking insane. Emily laughed, a wild, hysterical laugh that echoed through the empty hallway. Maybe, she said, wiping a tear from the corner of her eye. But you made me this way. Brad's chest rose and fell rapidly. His entire body trembled. His gang stood behind him, watching frozen in shock. And then it happened. Brad reached into his pocket and pulled out a knife. Laugh now, he snarled. Beg for your life. Emily didn't move. She didn't flinch. Instead, she stepped forward, pressing her chest against the tip of the blade. I won't beg, she whispered. You deserve this, Brad. You all do. You should all rot in hell. That was the moment Brad snapped. With a furious scream, he swung the knife. The blade slashed across Emily's neck, cutting deep. Blood sprayed onto the lockers, onto the floor, onto Brad's shaking hands. For a moment, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Emily staggered back, clutching her throat as blood poured through her fingers. Her knees buckled, and she collapsed onto the cold floor. Her vision blurred. She could hear the distant sound of footsteps running, people screaming, but she was at peace. As her life slipped away, she saw the horrified faces of the boys. They hadn't expected this. They had wanted to scare her, maybe beat her up, but not this. And now it was too late. The last thing Emily saw before darkness consumed her was Brad dropping the knife, staring at his blood-covered hands in disbelief. Then everything went silent. The moment Emily's body hit the ground, the school erupted into chaos. Students who had been passing by rushed to the scene, their horrified screams filling the hallways. Teachers stormed in, their eyes widening in shock at the sight of Emily lying in a pool of blood. One of the students pulled out their phone and dialed 911 with trembling fingers. But by the time the paramedics arrived, it was too late. Emily was gone. The police arrived shortly after, questioning students and gathering witness statements. It didn't take long for them to piece together what had happened. Emily had been seen being dragged away by Brad and his gang. Several students had overheard the argument in the hallway, and a few had even caught glimpses of Brad holding the knife. It was an open and shut case. The police rounded up the 7 boys and took them into custody. At the station, the interrogation began. Brad was in shock. He barely spoke, barely moved. His hands were still stained with Emily's blood. But when the officers asked him why he had done it, his expression twisted into something unreadable. She ruined us first, he muttered. She ruined our lives. The police pressed for more details, and slowly, the full truth unraveled. The bullying, the harassment, Emily's revenge, and the incurable STD that had sealed their fate. The news spread like wildfire. Emily's mother collapsed in grief when she received the call. She had already lost so much in life, and now her only daughter was gone. The school principal was forced to address the entire student body. He promised that from now on, strict measures would be taken to prevent bullying. But it was too little, too late. Emily was dead, and 7 boys were facing a future behind bars. The case went to court, and the media followed it closely. Brad, as the one who had wielded the knife, was charged with second-degree murder. His defense tried to argue that it was a crime of passion, that he hadn't meant to kill Emily, only to scare her, but the prosecution painted a different picture. They showed the evidence, the bullying, the threats, the years of torment Emily had endured. The jury didn't take long to reach a decision. Brad was sentenced to 25 years in prison. The rest of the boys, though they hadn't physically killed Emily, were found guilty of assault and aiding in the crime. They received lighter sentences, but they would still serve time. More importantly, they would carry the burden of their actions for the rest of their lives. Emily never got justice in life, but in death she became a symbol. Her story sparked a national conversation about bullying, about revenge, about the consequences of cruelty. Her mother fought to create awareness programs in schools, ensuring that no child would suffer the way her daughter had. And Brad? He spent his days in a prison cell, haunted by the memory of Emily's final laugh. She had won. Even in death, she had won. Emily's story was not just a tale of revenge. It was a tragic reflection of how unchecked cruelty could spiral into irreversible consequences. She had been a victim long before she chose to become the perpetrator. For a year, she had suffered in silence, tormented by those who saw her as weak, an easy target. They had stripped away her dignity, broken her spirit, and reduced her existence to a daily battle for survival. And when fate dealt her the cruelest blow, an incurable STD, she made a choice that sent shockwaves through her tormentors' lives. In the end, no one truly won. Emily got her revenge, but at the cost of her own life. Brad and his gang paid the price for their actions, but their sentences could never undo what had been done. They would live with their mistakes, their guilt, and the irreversible damage they had caused, not just to Emily, but to themselves. Emily's mother was left with nothing but grief and an empty home. Her daughter's laughter replaced by silence. The school, once indifferent to bullying, finally took action, but only after a life had been lost. The media moved on. The world continued spinning. But those who had been part of the tragedy, Brad, his gang, Emily's mother, would never forget. Emily's death became a painful lesson. Cruelty breeds more cruelty, and revenge never truly heals wounds. In the end, it only deepens them. Her story became a warning, one that would echo long after the blood had dried on the school hallway floor. Thank you for reading this story. If you'd like to stay updated with similar stories and never miss an update, be sure to hit the subscribe button and stay with us.